Hello, this is Tanya from 5th year BA School of Law, Exime University. This video will explain the concept of separation of powers, its origin, and its implementation in the Indian and foreign scenarios. For the governance of a democratic country, there should be fairness, impartiality, and uprightness in the workings of a government to ensure that the powers are separated within the different organs of a democracy. Although it is not followed in a strict sense, most of the democratic countries have adopted its diluted version under their respective constitutions. Definition: the concept of separation of powers refers to a system of government in which the powers are divided among multiple branches of the government, each branch controlling different facets of the government. In most of the democratic countries, it is accepted that the three branches are the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. According to this theory, the powers and the function of these branches must be distinct, separated in a free democracy. These organs work and perform their functions independently without the interference of one into another's in order to avoid any kind of conflict. Origin or the historical evolution of separation of power. The doctrine of separation of power emerged in the ancient era. Aristotle, in his book Politics, discussed the concept of separation of power, stating that every constitution should have a heterogeneous form of government consisting of mainly three branches: the deliberative, public officials, and the judiciary. A similar structure of government was observed in the Roman Republic, setting off the principle of check and balances in the country. Further, in the 17th century, during the arrival of Parliament in England, this theory of three branches of government was reiterated by John Locke in his book Two Treatises of Government, but with some different view. According to him, the three branches neither should have equal powers nor work independently. In his opinion, the legislative branch must be supreme out of all of the three, and other branches should be controlled by the monarch. His theory was based on the system of government which was prevailing in England at that time, that is, coexistence of democratic as well as the autocratic form of government. In the 18th century, the book Trias Politica, or the Doctrine of Separation of Power, was theorized meticulously by French jurist Baron de Montesquieu. He put some emphasis on the independence of judicial branch. He described that rather being ostensible, the judiciary must be authentic in nature. In his viewpoint, one organ or one person should not discharge the function of all other organs, and the reason was to safeguard and protect the freedom of the individuals and avoidance of tyrannical rule. In his book De l'Esprit des Lois, which is the spirit of the laws, in which he wrote in 1748, he propounded that the executive should not exercise the legislative or judicial powers because this may threaten the freedom and liberty of individuals. The legislative should not exercise executive or judicial power as this may lead to arbitrariness and hence end the liberty. The judiciary should not exercise the executive or legislative power because then a judge would behave like a dictator. What is the objective of separation of power? Firstly, it aims to eliminate arbitrariness, totalitarianism, and tyranny and promote an accountable and democratic form of government. Secondly, it prevents the misuse of power within different organs of the government. The Indian Constitution provides limits and boundaries for each domain of the government, and they are supposed to perform their function within such limits. Thirdly, it keeps a check on all the balances of the government by making them accountable for themselves. Fourthly, separation of power maintains a balance among the three organs of the government by dividing powers among them so that powers do not concentrate on any one branch, leading to arbitrariness. Fifthly, this principle allows branches to specialize themselves in their respective field with an intention to enhance and improve the efficiency of the government. Elements of separation of power. Uh, Separation of power is divided between three bodies which are legislative. It is the organ of the government which is also known as the rule making body. The primary function of the legislature is to make law for good governance of a state. It has the authority of amending the existing rules and regulations as well. The second is executive. This branch of government is responsible for governing the state. The executives mainly implement and enforce the laws made by the legislature. The president and the bureaucrats form the executive branch of the government. Then it's judiciary. Judiciary plays a crucial role in any state. It interprets and applies the law made by the legislature and safeguards the rights of the individuals. Separation of powers in practice. In UK Constitution, it practices the unitary parliamentary constitutional monarchy. The concept of separation of powers is applied in the UK, but not in its rigid sense because the UK has an unwritten constitution. The Crown is the head of the state, whereas the Prime Minister is recognized as the head of the government. The executive and the legislative are somehow interconnected to one another. Thus, we can conclude that UK Constitution has incorporated the separation of power just to keep checks and balances among the three organs of the government, but there exists some kind of interference of one organ in another. In the US Constitution, uh, mm, uh, the US has a written constitution and governed by the presidential form of government. The cornerstone of the constitution of US is the doctrine of separation of power. This concept is well defined and clear under the American Constitution. The president and his ministers are the executive authority and they are not members of the Congress. The ministers are accountable to the president only and not to the Congress. The tenure of the president is fixed and independent of the majority in Congress. Separation of power in India. Like the UK, India also practices the parliamentary form of government in which executive and legislature are linked to each other. So the doctrine of separation of powers is not implemented in the strict sense. However, the composition of our constitution creates no doubt that the Indian constitution is bound by separation of power. There are various provisions under the Indian constitution that clearly demonstrates the existence of the doctrine of separation of power. Provisions that substantiate separation of power. For example, Article 53(1) or Article 154 of the Indian Constitution say that the executive powers of the Union and the state are vested in the President and Governor respectively and shall only be exercised directly by him or through his subordinate officer. Article 122 and Article 212 of Indian Constitution state that the courts cannot inquire in the proceedings of Parliament and the state legislature. This ensures that there will be no interference of the judiciary in the legislature. Article 105 and Article 194 of the Constitution specify that member of parliaments and MLAs cannot be called by the court for whatever they speak in the session. Similarly, Article 40 of the 50 of the Indian Constitution encourage the separation of judiciary from the executives in the state. Similarly, there are some overlapping provisions. For example, Article 123 that allows president to issue ordinance when both the houses are not in session. Article 213 gives power to the governor to issue ordinance when the state legislative assembly is not in session. Article 356 lists provision of presidential rule in case of state of emergency. Article 145 states that the Supreme Court to make laws with approval of the President for court proceedings and practices. Article 146 says lays down the rule for the appointment of the servants or officers of the Supreme Court by the Chief Justice of India with consultation with President and the UPSC. Article 229 states that for the appointment of the servants and officers of the high courts with the consultation of governor and the state public service commission. Article 124 of the constitution gives president the power to appoint judges of the supreme court. Similarly, article 32 to 26 and 136 of the Indian constitution provide power of judicial review to the supreme court to strike down any law made by the parliament or any other administrative action which is found to be unconstitutional. judicial approach towards separation of power in India. The court has interpreted the applicability of doctrine of separation of power in India in many case laws. For example, Ram Javaya Kapoor versus State of Punjab. In this case, in this case, it was concluded that the Constitution of India has not acknowledged the doctrine of separation of power empathetically, but the function and power of all the organs have been adequately distinguished. Thus, it would not be wrong to say that Indian Constitution does not behold assumptions; rather, it works in a flexible manner, considering the needs of the country. So the executive can exercise the lawmaking power only when delegated by the legislation, and it is also empowered to exercise judicial power within the limits. In the case of Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan, it was stated that a rigid sense of separation of power, which has been given under the American and Australian Constitution, does not apply to India. The separation of power is a part of the basic structure of the Constitution. So the schemes of the Constitution cannot be changed even after restoring Article 368 of the Indian Constitution. In Golaknath versus State of Punjab, it was observed by Subba Rao, Chief Justice, that the three organs of the government have to exercise their functions keeping in mind certain encroachments assigned by the Constitution. The Constitution demarcates the jurisdiction of three organs minutely and expects them to be exercised within their respective powers without overstepping their limits. In the case of A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras, although the Constitution has imposed some limitations on the three organs of the government, it has left the Parliament and state legislature supreme in their respective fields. In the main, in the main subject to the limitations, our Constitution has preferred the supremacy of legislature to that of the judiciary, and the court has no authority to question the wisdom or policy of the law duly made by the appropriate legislature, and this is the basic fact which the court must outlook. What is the relevance of separation of power in the modern era? Although the doctrine of separation of power does not have rigid applicability, that does not imply that it has no relevance in the current scenario. The core objective of this doctrine is to keep checks and balances among the three organs of the government, which is an essential factor to run a government dynamically. The logic behind this doctrine is not the strict classification, rather, it is the avoidance of concentration of power to a specific person or a body. This theory is not operative in its absolute sense, but yes, it is very advantageous if applied correlatively. Thus, not uh, im- impenetrable barriers and unalterable frontiers, but mutual curtailment and in the exercise of powers by the three organs of the state is the spirit of the doctrine of separation of power. Criticism of this doctrine. It is extraordinarily difficult to distinguish the power of the legislature, executive, and judiciary precisely. A smooth and stable government can exist only if there is cooperation among the three organs. Any attempt made to separate these organs into watertight compartments may lead to failure and inefficiency of the government. In this concept, if this concept is adopted in its totality, then it will become impossible to take certain actions. Consequently, neither the legislature can delegate the law-making power to the executive, which may have expertise in the subject matter, nor the courts can make laws related to the functioning of the courts and proceedings. In the present scenario, a state works for the welfare of the people. It has to resolve the complex issues of the society. In such circumstances, the principle of separation of power seems to be impossible. The imposition of this doctrine in its rigid conception will not lead to the effectuation of the objectives of the modern state. Montesquieu, by propounding this theory, aimed to protect and safeguard the freedom and liberty of the individuals, which is impossible by strict enforcement of separation of power. To conclude this presentation, I would like to say that the doctrine of separation of power must be interpreted in a relative form. In the era of liberalization, privatization, and globalization, separation of power has to be expounded in a wider perspective. It should not be curbed to the principle of restraint and strict classification only, but a group of power exercised in the spirit of cooperation, coordination, and in the interest of the welfare of the state. Though this doctrine is unfeasible in its rigid perception, nevertheless, its effectiveness lies in the prominence on those checks and balances which are necessary in order to avert maladroit government and to prevent abuse of power by different organs of the government. Thank you.